All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us for Mueller Field Station's virtual Speaking of Nature series. We're really grateful that you can join us this afternoon. And my name is Ali Esposito. I'm the Conservation Education Outreach Coordinator at Mueller. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, just a little background information on who we are. Mueller Field Station is part of Finger Lakes Community College. We are located in the southern Honeyway Valley, just south of Honeyway Lake, and we offer a variety of different environmental education programs, ranging from college courses, conservation courses that happen here, K through 12 programming, and community outreach such as this series. So if you're interested in staying up to date on the projects that are happening here, or you just want to learn some cool stuff about this region of the world, then you can totally follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and we would greatly appreciate that. So just an announcement, our next Speaking of Nature event will be on Thursday, January 14th at 2 p.m. We are having Wild Wings Nature Center join us with a few different birds of prey, and they'll be discussing these birds of prey, introducing them to us. So it should be a really cool event, and we hope you can join us for that. Just look for a Facebook event and a link connected to that, and we hope to see you there. So moving on, our Speaking of Nature events, they typically cover topics such as forest pathology, lake health, wildlife biology, really science-driven topics. And today we are shifting our focus to the topic of culture, and more specifically Haudenosaunee people's culture. So the Haudenosaunee people, they have a very deep connection and relationship with the land, and with all of with water, with food, with basically all of the elements of earth, and their relationship is rooted in reciprocity and respect. And Michael is going to get into the history of the Haudenosaunee people, or relationship with the land, and how it's changed over time, and how it's just different perspectives nowadays, current views. And joining us today is Michael Galban, and he is the curator for the Seneca Art and Culture Center at Ganondagan State Historic Site. And Michael has expert knowledge of Native American material culture and art, specializing in Eastern woodland cultures. He is actively working with many Haudenosaunee communities to preserve ancient arts, and has been doing that for over 20 years. He recently published a book on the art of Robert Griffin, and he also was recently appointed to the board of directors of the Museum Association of New York. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. This was a highly anticipated event. We have over 300 people attending right now, so that's really amazing. Before I pass it over to you, I just want to address questions and how we'll handle that. So we may take some questions throughout the presentation, but we will certainly have time at the end to answer questions. And there are 300 people, so we'll do our best to cover as much as we can. Okay, I think that's it. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Michael, and thank you.
And I come from the Washoe tribe of Nevada and California, and I'm also a Mono Lake Paiute. And yet I lived the majority of my life here in what is now New York State. And because of my connections to Haudenosaunee people through my family, my wife and my kids, it became important to me to understand very clearly what is the long history of Haudenosaunee people in this area, because I saw that it wasn't being taught properly. So that's really what drove me to investigate further these questions of history. I've been here a long time in in the area, and I've been very fortunate to listen to and to hear and learn from some of the great Haudenosaunee leadership, elders, and knowledge bearers, over the years. And so that's really shaped my thinking about history and about time and about presence on a landscape. When I saw the title of this presentation as a land acknowledgement, that was kind of comical to me, because I'm not really presenting a land acknowledgement at all. I think people have come to understand the concept of a land acknowledgement in a different way, right? It's never been, as a Native person, it's never been we've never had the need to acknowledge that this was our land. It's just inherent in us. So, but for non-Native people, I see a great value in challenging their notions of land and ownership and presence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about people on the land, and I'm going to talk a little bit about history and how the United States has been talking about this idea. Last year this is just a little anecdotal story. I was asked to review some small exhibit copy, some text that would be placed in Albany as part of an initiative that the governor wanted to promote. It would be an exhibit on the settlers of New York State, right? And they asked that I take a look at the text for what they were describing as the earliest settlers of New York State, meaning Indigenous people, meaning Native people. And, I immediately tore into that text and basically rewrote it, because the notion that Native people are just simply the earliest settlers of this land is an absolute attack on our sense of belonging to the land. And so that was my first sort of clue to the way that this discussion is going to go, about how it is Native people come to be on this land, how we arrived, how we regard our sense of ownership, our sense of belonging, stewardship, and our place, in the vast history of this land, right? So I need to start at the beginning, right, to kind of explain to people, when we say that, when you ask an Indigenous person, a Native person, how long have your people been here? What is how long have you been here? And inevitably our answer is always, is that we've always been here. My people have always been here. And some people say we emerged here, however they put it to you. The point is that they are saying they always have been here. And this, you could be taking that in a couple of different ways. In a practical way, you might say that our cultures emerged here, our cultures emerged here at some point, and we became ourselves here on the land, wherever that land is for you as an Indigenous person, right? And then I oftentimes turn it around to people, and I say, well, when did Americans become American? When did that take place? And it turns out we know exactly when. We know the date, in fact. And I'm not going to, in 1776, when there was a Declaration of Independence from their parent country, England, that's really when Americans became Americans, right? And so people have asked me, how long have Haudenosaunee people been here on the land? I said, from the beginning, from the point when they became themselves. And what is that point, right? That's another good question. So let's get into that question a little bit, right? So we know that there was, around 20, I think it's about 22,000 years ago, the last glacier kind of descended from Canada down into what is now New York State, right? And it reached that the Allegheny Mountains and the plateau there, and that sort of acted as a dam to prevent it from traveling further. And the ice thickened, and then, the ebb and flow of our world, around 13,000 years ago, or so, it disappeared and exposed this where I'm sitting right now, which is in the northern end of the Finger Lakes. And so I wondered about, how long people had been living here. Were they here before that glacier? Were they here during that glacier? What does that even mean, And I was invited a while ago to look at the Metacroft Rock Shelter Site in northwestern Pennsylvania. And when I went there, it was really eye-opening. This was a site that was nearly continuously occupied up into what we call the historic and even colonial period. It was an outcropping where there was, created this shelter underneath. And there was an excavation that took place there by a man named Dr. James Adavizio. And I got to meet him, and I got to hear the story of this rock shelter. And what he told me was that Native people had been living there in that region and occupying that rock shelter off and on, intermittently, for, in some cases, 16,000 years before now. And in one case, possibly 19,000 years ago. And that was amazing. He told me the story because he saw it as an important place because of its longevity, continuous use, but also because it was challenging what is at that time, and has been really since, a scientific boundary of human occupation, which has, since his discovery and other discoveries of early sites around North, Central, and South America, has been eroded. But at the time, there was the entire scientific community, archaeologists, were basing their chronology of North America on an early culture, which they called the Clovis people. And these Clovis people, so-called Clovis people, they created a particular type of stone point, and it's a fluted point. In other words, it's like if you imagine a classic arrowhead, but it doesn't have notches or anything. At the base end are these long scar flutes, which allowed it to be stuck into the end of a shaft or a foreshaft. And so archaeologists have classified those people who made those points as being a culture. They called them Clovis culture because the first ones they found were in Clovis, New Mexico. So anywhere that they found these points, that to them indicated that there was a similarity amongst the people culturally, but also in time. And they said, well, the Clovis people, arrived or emerged sometime around 11,000 years ago. And so when Dr. Adavizio began to find evidence that predated Clovis culture in northwestern Pennsylvania, he realized that he would have to tread carefully because he would receive all the attacks from his established scientific community, people who had really hinged their careers on these notions, this chronology of Clovis people. And so he was very careful. And to date, he really has survived. His study has survived the attacks from a community of academics who, in some cases, their whole purpose is to defend this idea of Clovis first. In other words, the Clovis people are the first humans in North America. Since then, that idea has been really eroded, and new ideas have emerged, right? And this Meadowcroft excavation and study really contributed to that. And so when I was down there, I asked Dr. Adebizio, I said, you know, in the Northeast, right, the Northeast part of this North America, like this rock shelter couldn't possibly have been the very first footprint that somebody left behind, right? And he said, no, certainly not. I said, well, what in your estimation? You've done a lot of work on this. This has been your career. So what do you think? How long have people been in the Northeast of North America? And he said 25,000 years ago. So we're talking about millennia, 25 millennia is what he's talking about. And the evidence that we see could be around 19,000 years ago, real scientific evidence. And so when we start thinking about those vast periods of time of people living on this land, and then forming their culture on the land with the landscape, living here, having intimate knowledge of it, it's forever. For all intents and purposes, that's forever, really. So in another way, you might say, okay, so what does that mean in forever to a people, right? Have lived here forever. And so when we talk about Haudenosaunee people, we're talking about a confederacy of 6 nations that formed itself around a law that they call the Great Law, the Gainashakoa, or Gainalagoa, you speak Mohawk. And this law that formed persevered and sustained Haudenosaunee people over time and in many places until this very moment. And so that culture which emerged, was it, we know when that happened, when when that occurred, it was called the time of the peacemaker, and there was one way of living before that, and then another way of living after, when the Great Law was adopted and the people formed together and created a way of living. Before that, were they different people? No, they're the same people, but they were thinking differently culturally. And there was that transformation, is what we kind of point to as saying, like, that's when Haudenosaunee people became themselves. But before that, were they Haudenosaunee people? Well, in a way, yes, of course they were, they were and are, those people prior to the arrival of the peacemaker. Yeah, they're Haudenosaunee people, but they experienced a transformation. And that's always been the strategy of Native people in North America, is our ability to adapt and to, you might say, survive according to change. And so when we think about the people in the western part of the Confederacy, Seneca people, we're talking about people who had been living here on and off, and moving around for a long, long time, thousands and thousands of years. Were they the same people 11,000 years ago as they are today? Culturally distinct and different, So I'm going to bring up another point. The people that lived, as the glaciers exposed the land, living on that land, right? The people who lived there lived very differently than the way we understand Haudenosaunee people culturally today. Long houses, growing the 3 sisters, that kind of that idea. Well, the people long ago, before, we're talking millennia before, they were living differently. And so I'll tell you that story, right? So these people were living in smaller groups. They moved about quite a bit, They were sort of broadband. In other words, they were taking advantage of all kinds of resources of the landscape to support themselves. And so they were doing things like hunting, they were fishing, they were trapping even, and they were collecting food from different places as it became available to them. And they relied quite heavily on this sort of hunting and fishing idea, right? In parallel with that, though, I mean, some people might reduce that style of life to hunter-gatherer, right? Which to me is like offensive. That doesn't describe how people were living, hunting and gathering, like some, senseless beast, opportunistically moving through the landscape. That's not how people lived. So in parallel to hunting and fishing and trapping and that kind of existence, right, that kind of way of supporting yourself, an economy that really required you to move quite a bit around when fish spawning occurred, when certain plants were ripe. In parallel, they were also modifying the environment to encourage plant growth. And we know that they were doing early seed selections to produce foods that would be more beneficial to them later on. So in a way, I don't know what kind of farming that is, but you might say it was like a passive farming. But so they're encouraging plant growth. We know that now, looking at the archaeology of some of these very early sites and finding the plant matter and seeds of these plants that they were using, and recognizing that seeds that the indigenous people were collecting were larger. They had more nutritional value because of the thickness of the seed walls, for example, things like that. And so in parallel with this, the notion of hunter and gathering people, right, moving around the landscape, they were also doing very scientific and very sort of ingenious farming techniques. They were using these techniques to promote the growth of certain plants, goosefoot, for example, types of barleys, and sunflowers and squashes even. They were doing this very early, long ago, thousands of years ago. But what really, you might say, transformed the way that people were living was when corn found its way up from Mesoamerica into the Northeast. And they say that the first corns, archaeologically, emerged, you sort of see them on the edges of the water, to be honest, in Iroquois territories, around 2,000 years ago. That's when they first started to appear archaeologically. It took a long time for people to adapt to this new food source. And it took them really centuries to cultivate and develop what we consider today as the Iroquoian style or Haudenosaunee style of agriculture. That took place around 1,200 years ago. So it was many years of adaptation, many years of selecting seed, many years of developing a new way of living that shifted the way that you spent your time during the year. So originally you were moving around the landscape quite a bit, and you were hunting and fishing, and like I described earlier, collecting naturally pre-existing plants and berries and fruits and things. So that required a lot of your time. And then corn emerged, and suddenly you have the capacity to grow a huge amount of your food economy in one place. And not only were you able to do that during the growing season, right, but you were also able to store it and stay in one location year round. And so that taking place around 1,200 years ago, really, was revolutionary. And there was along with that came the social change too, where the bulk of the community's economy was now being supported by women who were the farmers, agriculturalists. They're the ones who were developing the seeds, saving them, you know, selecting and whatnot. So they were now in charge of really the bulk of the community's economy, you know, and it relieved a lot of the pressure from the community because you don't have to travel so much. You don't have to spend your time moving quite a bit. And, you know, when you're collecting from the bounty of the forest and the fields and the wetlands, it requires a lot of time. But when you have corn, you really have relieved yourself of a lot of that burden. And so now, not only do you know, have more free time, but you also have the need for larger communities to group together and produce lots and lots of corn. And so when the Europeans begin to arrive in North America, they encounter Haudenosaunee people sort of culturally fully realized and have become themselves. They stay in large communities, big towns of thousands of people, really. Here at Ganondagan, in the middle of the historic period, you've got like 4,000 Seneca people living at Ganondagan, you know, for example. So you have huge communities, you know, lots of help to work those fields of corn. That's not all you're growing, obviously. You're still growing squash. Little bit later on, beans becomes very important, and it's like in full swing. You've got the Three Sisters going on together, and the community is more or less year round in one place. You have vast fields that you're cultivating, that are under cultivation. And during the year, the spring, summer, you have lots of woods edge, which attracts animals to the edge of the woods. And so you can hunt year round around your community at the woods edge, really. And then in the fall, leave your community, travel quite far away to a hunting camp, and spend, you know, that time after harvest all the way up until the middle of the winter, you know, hunting and bringing back all that meat, and that sustains you throughout the rest of the year, you know. So the way that people had sort of changed with the environment, and as corn naturally migrated north and emerged, it becomes this real transformative period, you know, in your economy, in your environment, and in your society. So it's no mistake that, you know, 1,200 years ago, this revolution, this food revolution occurs. And then in the same time, you have sort of this cultural change too, where you have the Confederacy and is established and the Great Law is given. When I first started working at Ganondagan in the early 1990s, and I was trying to understand some of the, you know, the chronology, you might say, and I heard Chief Corbett Sundown, whenever he was asked, how long ago was the Confederacy formed? He said, around 1,000 years ago. And I was like, there we go. 1,000 years ago, you know, 1,200 years ago, you have this corn revolution. You got a transformation where the majority of the economy is now being managed by women. It just seems like it's all moving quite nicely into a really balanced way of living. So that's sort of the way that it all kind of pieces together historically, for me anyways. It's important to note that when you look try to investigate these dates and times and such, that you look at when the articles are written. So when I started to look into this question in the 90s, that really was the standard to say, like, 10,000, 11,000 years ago, that's when people began to emerge in North America. And ever since then, that date has been gradually pushed back, and an accepted date has been pushed back further and further and further for us. And it's my impression that eventually it will have very little meaning. I mean, when we're talking millennium, it doesn't have the same kind of meaning. It loses meaning, you know. those vast amounts of time begin to lose meaning when we're talking about 20,000, 25,000, 50,000. Like, does it even matter anymore? You know, we are the original people, the indigenous people of North America, and we've always been here. That's my ultimate point. Any questions before I continue?
Can we buy seeds at Ganondagan? And somebody commented, corn revolution is the best way I've ever heard explaining the celebration of Haudenosaunee culture.
Yeah, okay, great. So if you're talking about corn seed, the Friends of Ganondagan operate the Iroquois White Corn Project, which is designed to remove the burden of long processing times for white corn and reintroduce it into people's diet, particularly Native people, but they sell it as a product. It's already been, processed. They have 3 versions of it. They have whole kernel corn, which is something you would make a soup out of. They have ground white corn, and then they have roasted corn too, ground roasted. And so you can use that like a grain, those flour versions or those ground corn versions. But the seeds are not available. And there's different ideas about why and why not seed, why and why not make seed available to people. And it's a discussion related to, this crazy notion of copywriting and having ownership over seed and the genetic material that your seed carries. And so I think the decision was basically to not distribute seed, and that to allow the Haudenosaunee versions to remain as cultural patrimony. So no, you can't get seed here, sorry. Okay, so what is the relationship then that we understand, as we understand it, between Haudenosaunee people and environment? And all of my knowledge of this, I have to just admit that these are not my own ideas. These are ideas that were passed to me from countless elders, speakers, people who I could ask questions about, and so I'm no expert on this, but it is my understanding, as imperfect as it might be, right? But I'll say this, that Haudenosaunee people live in a social world, okay? There is this concept that Native people live in a natural world, right? We live in a natural world. But truly, Haudenosaunee people live in a social world. And the reason why I say that is because in order for any communication to begin, Haudenosaunee people must put you into context, a context which is sort of familial, okay? And so just to give you an example, when Europeans arrived here, the first question probably that the Haudenosaunee people probably had to face was, are these in fact people? Are they humans like us? Are they Ongwe like us? Are they humans like us? And once that was established, they could then put those people into context. So if they're humans, then how do they fit into our sort of sense of the universe? And the way that Haudenosaunee people do that is they assign you a familial term. And so, the English became known, and in the French became known as the fathers. you know, and they would say, our fathers, our English fathers, or our French fathers, right? And of course, the Europeans loved that. They loved that idea, you know, because they come from a patriarchal society and system. And so they loved being called the fathers, right? But if you understand Haudenosaunee concepts of the family, the most important individual is your mother, not really your father. From her, you gain your lineage, you gain your identity. Your identity flows from your mother to you, and so your nation is inherited through your mother's side, and so is your clan. Your name, in fact, comes from the clan that your mother gave you, and so really the term father, the father really wasn't the most important person in your household, and he wasn't the person you saw the majority of the year. And then even to extend it even further, your father isn't even your teacher, your primary teacher. It's really your mother's brothers, your clan uncles. Those are the ones who or if you're a young man, those are the ones who teach and train you, right? Those are your first teachers. And of course, they teach and train all the children too, not just the boys, but the girls too, everyone in the family. And so those terms are reserved very specifically for others, not for the Europeans. They don't call the Europeans uncles. They don't call them mothers. They call them fathers, which is very telling. So that's a people-to-people relationship. So what about the people-to-land relationship? Well, you probably have all heard of the concept of our mother, the earth. You know, our mother, the earth, right? Well, that is a real concept, and it didn't emerge in the 60s with the hippie culture. It's an indigenous concept. The earth is our mother, and the earth cares for us as a mother does to a child, provides us with all the things that we need. So let's extend that. Or what are we going to talk about? Let's talk about animals. Well, people call the animals our brothers, the four-leggeds. And so when someone hunts and they're a hunter and they're learning to hunt, they're learning to respect. They're learning the behavior of their brothers. They're learning how to hunt from the brothers. They're teaching you, you know. And then when the time comes to take an animal, it's the ultimate sacrifice that a brother would sacrifice themselves for you so that you can live on, right? And who wouldn't do that for a true brother? And so they do that for us. And so there's a relationship in the family between the humans and the animals. And even the foods that we talked about earlier. They say our three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, right? They are our sisters. They're part of our family, you know. They say if you look to the heavens and you see the sun, they say it's our elder brother, the great warrior, the sun, right? And if you look at the nighttime orb, the moon is our grandmother, the moon, right? So everything fits into this real social relationship. And so it's a family of existence, a social existence. And yes, it has natural components, but people are living in this social world of their own design. So when you have the Haudenosaunee people forming together in a confederacy, you have the Senecas and the Mohawks are the elder brothers on the eastern and western borders. You have the Cayugas and the Oneidas as younger brothers to their neighboring nations, right? It's a family living under one roof, they say, with the sky being the roof and the earth being the floor. And that's where they live, in a social world, right? And nature becomes a part of your social circle. And so your relationship to that is different than as a steward or an owner. You know, how can you own your mother, right? You can't own your mother. the idea, the concept that the state owns the animals on the land, like that is an absolute alien concept to Native people. I mean, I would say to all Native people, not just Haudenosaunee people. Alien concept. How can you own the trees, right? And so that kind of difference culturally between Europeans and Native people creates lots of problems, and it had created lots of problems. There were wars started over animals, wars started over peaches, wars started over this idea that you own the natural world, you know. So where are we at here? 2:14. So we're coming up on my Q&A time. I'm gonna lay one more concept on you, and then we'll get to some questions. So anciently, long ago, Haudenosaunee people entered into an agreement with others, which came to be known as the one dish and one spoon agreement. And it's characterized by a shell wampum mat or belt. People call them today belts, but it might be called a mat too. And this concept was that the land was regarded as a bowl. And in certain instances, when this agreement is entered into, you might even say the Great Lakes themselves are the bowl. And all of the land around them, you know, around the bowl is being shared. And the idea is that with one spoon, each people can take out of the bowl what they need, their resources. And so you would not come into conflict by taking from that bowl. And so it was an agreement, a mutual use agreement, that this bowl is for everyone, and we should not fight over people taking from the bowl, whether it's fish, whatever they need from that bowl. We should not fight over it. And that agreement was made over and over with different people. But the Haudenosaunee people, commemorate it in an actual wampum belt, a wampum mat. And if somebody's interested, they could reach out to me. I could show them a picture of it, you know. So that is sort of the last land use concept I wanted to share with you. And I think I'll open it to questions. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Okay, Michael, there are questions. I don't know if you can see the chat, but if you want me to read them aloud, I can do that too.
I can see the chat. I didn't look at the Q&A, so.
Okay. Let's see. Most people are actually using the chat instead of the Q&A.
Okay.
So I'll go back to the chat. How can we best re-educate regarding the phrase and concept of hunter-gatherers in our discussion with friends, family, and colleagues? Re-educate and keep it real without isolating and ostracizing the individual. Shannon, this is from Shannon on Onondaga land. Thank you for this.
Okay, I kind of caught some of what you asked or what she said, but could you repeat the first part of it?
Yeah, sure. How can we best re-educate regarding the phrase and concept of hunter-gatherers in our discussion with friends, family, and colleagues?
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's a good question. I think that if you, words matter, right? They do. And, you know, one of the greatest deceptions ever was sticks and stones can break my bones, right? But words can never hurt me. And we know now that that's not true. They do actually hurt. And so, and they can inhibit, and they can shape people's minds to inherent bias, right? So what do? Well, I mean, there are certain people that need labels to characterize concepts. And sometimes I use them, right? I do, but a lot of times it's just easiest to explain the way of life, you know, that people had. What would you call a people who, you know, participate in passive farming, and also hunted wild game, and encouraged the growth of wild fruits. And what do you call those people? And to me, I would say that they're native people and indigenous people, and as time goes on, people's lifestyles change, and I don't, to me, the labeling is the limiting. It limits you when you use labels. It limits concepts when you use labels. So I just fully explain, I guess. So.
Thank you. There's a lot of questions. Hold on one second. Are there stories / narratives or other cultural artifacts from the proto-historic and prehistoric periods of this Haudenosaunee culture?
Are there stories that relate to the protohistoric period? Is that essentially what they're asking?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yes, that's the short answer. Yes. Some of them are, some of the stories that are told really talk about the Pleistocene era, they talk about the great bear, even some people say the great pig, like the, what do you call it? The mastodon, they talk about the mastodon in some of these stories that have survived until the modern era, Some people say that the Finger Lakes was created by the great bear, whose claws, scraped up and caused the furrows that filled with water, right? And probably that's a metaphor that the glacier was the great bear, and as it left, it clawed the earth as it receded up into the north. One thing that's really important to understand about Haudenosaunee people is that the language and the way that they describe things is always very, it's not literal, it's symbolic. And so people whose language is actually based on metaphor, when they speak and share stories, that's really what there's always a secondary meaning. So that's kind of important to think about when you begin to learn Haudenosaunee stories. Yeah.
Okay. I live in the Adirondacks. Can you please explain or expand on why the Mohawks and Seneca were considered elder brothers? Thank you.
Okay, so part of it was sort of how they were situated geographically, but another reason was the population size was very large, and so that's how it was explained to me, that they were large in number and situated as protective brothers on either side of the territory. Older brothers protect the younger brothers.
Hold on. To what degree do non-material beings, or those who once were not, those who once were but no longer are, shape, influence the relationships of Haudenosaunee people with the land? Do you want me to repeat that?
It's hard to understand the real question, but one of the aspects of Haudenosaunee culture, which we really don't focus on here at Ganondagan, is there's a boundary between what people have said or what people regard as sacred, right, or spiritual, right? That kind of there is a people have asked that we not share those things with the public, and so I think that your question is on the edge of that. So Yeah, I've got to leave it like that. Like, we don't really talk about sacred or spiritual concepts, some of them, you know. So I'm sorry.
Could you elaborate on hunting wild game? What concepts and ideas helped hunters decide when to sacrifice their brothers for food?
I would point to a the long version of the creation story that lays out that relationship between the animals and the people. And so um, you can find that long version. Um, let's see, where would you find it? You could find a written form of that in the actually John Mohawk wrote a book. John Mohawk, who's no longer with us, revised the creation story, and he not revised it, but put it into modern terminology from when it was recorded in sort of 19th century prose by John Arthur Gibson, a Seneca leader. And so he updated it into a sort of a modern syntax, I guess. And I'm like stalling here because I can't remember the name of the book, what he wrote, but you can look up John Mohawk Publications, find that version. And if you read that creation story, it'll kind of give you a sense of what is that, how did that relationship begin, and formed by that beginning times, you know, the creation, times of creation, at the time of creation. Yeah, it's a long story, and I don't really, we're only running out of time here, so I don't really have the ability to kind of lay it all out. But look that book up. I think it's like The Myth of the Earth Grasper. That might be the title.
I live in Berkeley on Ohlone. I'm not going to pronounce these right. Chochenyo land. There are active Indigenous and supporter communities here around environmental and climate issues. I also spend 3 months a year in upstate New York on the St. Lawrence River. Are there ways I can support Indigenous peoples' movements in upstate New York?
Oh, yeah. Are there ways you can support Indigenous movements in upstate New York? Yeah, right. The Native people we have always advocated for the natural world. We want to ensure that our children have clean water to drink, clean air to breathe. When we hunt, that the animals aren't contaminated and tainted and poisonous. When we fish, we want the same thing for the fish, you know. And so any movement which is dedicated to restoring the environment to balance is an Indigenous movement. And where they intersect in Indigenous communities related to water, related to air, or even land, those movements are where we need and can use allies. So by supporting, raising money for people who maybe found themselves arrested for protecting land or water, that might be a good place to start. So I think we have maybe time for one more.
Sure. Okay. His name's John McTeague. I am an AP US government teacher. Oh, sorry, I just moved. Submitted another question. I'm an AP US government teacher, math, science, and technology preparatory school in Buffalo. My class is sitting in on this presentation. IS, an immigrant from Uganda, wants to ask Mr. Galban about the motivations. He hit send too quickly. He's still typing. Oh, the motivations of the Haudenosaunee people for forming the Confederation.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. So the way it was explained to me is that people were had found themselves in a state of chaos, and that there was warfare and, you might say, warlords who were fighting and causing this chaos and this sort of never-ending cycle of violence, reciprocity, violent reciprocity, retribution, revenge, was driving the communities. And no one knows how it began, but they know that it was terrible, and the people were fighting, and they were being, in a way, led by these war captains who, maintained control through fear, and so this dark time, of intertribal warfare was the moment when the great law came amongst them through an individual known as the peacemaker. And so that was the motivation. It was to bring about peace between the nations. Well, I really appreciate everyone's questions. I'm sorry I can't get to more, but I would encourage you to come visit us at Ganondagan. Incredibly, we're open. We are open Wednesday through Saturdays, and you can visit us and see our exhibits, learn more about the relationship that the Haudenosaunee people have with the environment, learn about the history of this town of Ganondagan, and we'd love to see you. So take care, stay safe, and we'll see you down the road, okay?
Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate it.